We have to know the people. And when we know them well, we get more authority to speak life into them. We listen longer. We listen without judgment. We listen to love. And I think we're careful to not throw religion in their face so that they would reject it. We earn the right to speak about God's ways.
There are so many things to be confused about in the world right now. And one of those things, especially for kids, is gender, the idea of what gender is. And there are so many different studies that are being done right now to try to point our kids to have a idea of what gender is that really ends up being confusing not only for the kids, but also confusing for us as parents. We wonder sometimes if our understanding of gender is really the right way up. And trying to get that through to our kids can be so frustrating. Sometimes it can lead us into really dark places. But today on the Celebrate Kids podcast, in this daily segment, Facing the Dark, Dr. Kathy's going to unpack this for us a little bit, especially looking at one popular study that's being done right now and help us think well through it and then give us conversation points to have with our kids to help us reason with them, to get them to a place where confusion doesn't have to reign. So let's turn now to Dr. Kathy Cook.
Don't be afraid of the dark. Be careful with stars. Not every light is gonna guide you, baby. Not every light is gonna guide you.
So, Dr. Kathy, a study published in JAMA Pediatrics is finding that so-called transgender teenagers who have pursued medical interventions, things like puberty blockers or hormone therapies, are highly satisfied with their care. The lead author, Christina Olson, who's a psychologist and a professor at Princeton University, says that regret was actually very rare, according to the research. It's really the latest research from what's called the Trans Youth Project, which Olson started in 2013, when transgender youth was really an obscure research area, far from the political limelight that it is now today. Back then, she says, quote, "Our team was interested in recruiting a group of kids who were socially transitioning," she says, end quote. And she goes on to explain that that means that they started using new pronouns and different names and clothes in childhood, really between the ages of 3 and 12. They found 300 families and really followed them since that time period to see if, quote, what their life would look like as they moved into adolescence and adulthood, end quote. The families enrolled in the program have participated in many research projects over the years, according to Olson, from gender development and childhood to really mental health studies as they've matured. The plan is really to follow them for a total of 20 years. The study on regret and satisfaction is based on a survey of 220 of those families. By now, the kids are teenagers, and the average age of the participants is 16 years old. Several are taking either puberty blockers or cross-sex hormones. Olson says, quote, "What we found was that this group had very high levels of satisfaction," end quote. And she goes on to say that she knew from being in touch with the families that they seemed pretty happy with their care, but the results still surprise her. She's finding that more than 50% rate their satisfaction on a scale of 7 on a 7-point scale. You know, Dr. Kathy, I think we really need to talk about this, partly because these stats are stats that our kids and maybe much of the culture is hearing and really living into. What should we know about this? And when we hear news like this, what questions should we ask?
I always ask, what's the bias of the researcher? Because I know, as someone who has done research, that I can make almost anything come out the way I want it to come out. I would wonder what the bias is of Princeton University. And I would wonder what the bias is of this lead author, Christina Olson, and why did she work with the Trans Youth Project? Because I'm surprised by this data, and I'm wondering if it is pro this result that they were that they've been satisfied because of the questions that they were asked. So I would ask, what's the bias of the researcher and the bias of the institution that paid for the research? I would ask, what questions were they asked that would indicate a satisfaction with how well they're doing? Because you and I both know that the questions could cause them to say yes to things. I also wonder what happened to the other 80 families. right? So there were 300 families in the study. This data is based on 220. Did the other 80 families drop out because the children changed their mind and are no longer transitioning? That's huge data that is not being considered here.
Yeah, I think that that's really helpful, Dr. Kathy. It's really helpful for us, I think, to think through how we should, process or gain some of this information. And I want to ask you, as we kind of think through this a little bit more, that, I mean, let's say that kids are feeling better after so-called transition care, right? That they have experienced what this survey purports, some, medicines or what have you that's blocked the development, the natural development of their body towards a certain gender, and now they're in this other place. Is that the goal that we should really drive for our kids, to really feel better? Or what should the goal be for our kids who are really experiencing different confusion or maybe even full on gender dysphoria?
That is a significant question, Wayne. Really glad you asked that because it isn't feeling better. For the believer who knows that gender dysphoria can be real and yet is very dangerous, because if you're born male, you're male. If you're born female, you're female. A woman cannot become a man cannot become a woman. It is not possible. So what I would want for anyone who's struggling with gender dysphoria is that they would embrace the truth of their gender that they were born with, and that they would find support to live in the body that they were given by the Lord. And that we would find out, are you confused because of a myth, that boys can't cook? And you've been teased that because you love to cook, you must be so gay, or just be a woman and wear an apron. I mean, we got to find out, why are they confused, and how can we walk with them into clarification and truth. That's what I want for them, is truth and integrity and answers to the questions that they have that are causing them to believe these things about themselves.
To go on that, Dr. Kathy, what is the end goal then for them? So you make this seem like, and I don't want to be accusatory, it sounds like I'm arguing against you. I want to understand a little bit, and maybe even, I would say, kind of steelman this argument, because we're going to be in conversations like this. When we look at that, what would be then the ultimate goal of having them live into their gender? You kind of say that it's because they would live into who God has created them to be, but is there something to that they can hold on to that doesn't have to be tied tightly to, this idea of what I would call, or what the world probably calls, religion, right? That would just be your perspective on this issue. Is there something that we are calling the kids to, more than just kind of, I don't know, like binding themselves back to this idea that their parents have, or culture before this time period has, or maybe even religion has? What are your thoughts there?
I'm so grateful that you don't shy away from tough topics and tough questions. You lead well here. And this is tough. Before I knew God, I'm glad that I was living as if I did, if that makes any sense. Like, his ways are best. Can we model that and talk about that and teach that in ways that we don't even have to get out the Bible for, which would then cause resistance from those who don't yet know Jesus? I don't know, maybe. Can we, especially if we know someone well who's believing a lie, I think we need to speak up. Like, back to an illustration that I just used. If you have a man in your life or a teenage boy in your life who loves to cook, is good at it, and you just see the joy there, but he's been teased, or he's assuming that, he has to be a woman if he's going to cook. First of all, look at all the shows on TV that have male chefs. Just watch a few with him and affirm that it's okay to be a guy who likes to cook. And maybe he's super creative and his cakes are amazing and you want to eat them before you eat anything else. Like, affirm that for him and let him know that you can be a full-on male and have the creativity to be a chef. You don't have to believe the lie from culture if you've been teased into believing that that's so female, or whatever the case may be. What kind of role models do we introduce our kids to? What kind of truth do we expose them to? And I think, one of the best arguments against the gender dysphoria that is causing young people to attempt to transition are the detransitioners. So maybe we get some detransitioners in front of our young people through the TED Talks they've done and through some research that's been done in articles where they've spoken up to say how actually miserable they were while they were trying to live outside of God's natural design of their body. Yeah, this is tough. So what do we have to do? We have to know the people, and when we know them well, we get more authority to speak life into them. We listen longer. We listen without judgment. We listen to love. And I think we're careful to not throw religion in their face so that they would reject it. We earn the right to speak about God's ways. And we do it for ourselves too, right? One of the biggest battles that I've seen happen, that I think you've seen as well, is the Christian who calls gay, lesbian, bi, trans sin, and they ignore their own sin. And they ignore the other sins that person has. And so we got to be really careful there. That's a whole nother episode to talk about, but I think that's a relevant issue.
You know, I loved what Dr. Kathy had to say today. It reminded me of a passage that comes out of John chapter 3, and I'll begin reading at verse 3. Jesus replied, "Very truly I tell you, no one can enter the kingdom of God unless they're born again." "How can someone be born when they're old?" Nicodemus asked. "Surely they cannot enter a second time into their mother's womb to be born. Flesh gives birth to flesh, but the Spirit gives birth to spirit," Jesus replied. You know, Nicodemus was a Pharisee, a teacher of Israel, and he came to Jesus at night. I don't know about you, but my kids oftentimes have these big questions and are confused at night. And Nicodemus does this to Jesus, going to him to seek clarity about what he's teaching them. Now, Nicodemus struggled to grasp Jesus' spiritual metaphor about being born again. His confusion really was rooted in a literal interpretation of birth and a lack of understanding of spiritual transformation. But Jesus clarified that rebirth was of the spirit, not of the flesh, guiding Nicodemus to see beyond really the current framework to an eternal truth. You know, gender dysphoria often involves confusion, really about one's identity at a core level. Just as Jesus guided Nicodemus to a truth of spiritual identity, those of us that care for kids, mentors, and parents, we can really help children and teens understand that their identity is designed and it's organized by God. It's created by God. A rebirth in Christ involves finding peace and truth in God's creation, including the gift of being created male and female. Rather than rejecting the physical reality of their bodies, kids can be led to discover how their physical design aligns with God's purposeful plan. By addressing confusion with clarity and truth and love, we can help our kids find peace in who God created them to be. And I think that can be a bright light that shines and cuts through some of the darkest times they're going to face. I want to thank you for listening to the Celebrate Kids podcast, this daily segment, Facing the Dark. On behalf of Dr. Kathy Cook, my name is Wayne Stender, and I want to say thanks for listening today. And we'll see you here again tomorrow as we launch new Saturday episodes of the Celebrate Kids podcast. This Saturday, we're going to launch a talk that Dr. Kathy gave on identity and some of the tech lies that our kids encounter and how we can guide them as parents. Next week, we're going to start something that we had intended to start in the new year, and that's a Q&A segment. We want to field your questions and have Dr. Kathy address them, answer them. It's a great way for you to have some feedback on some of the real things that you're going with. We want to mentor you and walk through life with you. If you want to send us a question, just email us. You can email me at Wayne, that's Wayne, at celebratekids.com. And now I want to say thanks for listening, and we're looking forward to seeing you here again tomorrow.